Welcome to Talk Plus Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Butler, and I'm your host for Talk Plus Water. I'm also the principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find at waterdisputes.org. In addition, I'm editor-in-chief of Texas Plus Water and the Texas Water Journal. Both publications are free. My guest today is Dr. Margaret Cook. Margaret Cook is the Vice President of Water and Community Resilience at the Houston Advanced Research Center, also known as HARC. Margaret leads a team of experts building collaborative initiatives to enhance community resilience, sustainable development, and availability and affordability of clean water. She's a seasoned sustainability leader with a proven record of innovative research and solution development. With a strong foundation in engineering policy and the water energy climate nexus, she has successfully collaborated with diverse stakeholders to address critical challenges in these sectors, co-developing programs with communities and prioritizing those with the greatest need. Margaret's research focuses on developing and implementing solutions for water resource management, energy access and affordability, and climate adaptation. Margaret earned a doctorate in civil engineering with a certificate in engineering education, a master's degree in environmental and water resources engineering, and her Bachelor of Science in civil engineering, all from the University of Texas at Austin Cockrell School of Engineering. She also has a dual master's degree in public affairs from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT. And one final note, Margaret is on the editorial board of the Texas Water Journal. Margaret, welcome to Talk Plus Water, and thank you for taking time to talk with me.
Thanks for having me.
So I always start out with people's background in terms of when they realized that water was something that they wanted to focus on as their sole kind of issue in their career, or one of the things that they were interested in pursuing. So how about you? When did water first become, something that you said, hey, I want to, spend some of my career looking at water issues?
Well, I've always been interested in water. I'm from Corpus Christi, so was born on the coast and raised there. And we spent a lot of time at the beach and the Texas State Aquarium. I went to sea camp. We had water efficiency professionals come to school and talk to us about drought because drought is so persistent in Corpus. And I put in those devices with my family. So it was always something that I cared about. When I got to college, I chose to study civil engineering, and I thought I was going to build bridges. And I did not enjoy the bridge building classes, but I really loved those water ones. So that's how I ended up in that path, and then dug deeper into that and graduate school with the water energy nexus and water policy.
So today you're Vice President of Water and Community Resilience at HARC. So first of all, tell our listeners about HARC and then the focus on water and community resilience at HARC.
Sure. HARC, the Houston Advanced Research Center, is a sustainability-focused nonprofit based in the Woodlands, Texas. Our mission is to accelerate practical and sustainable solutions for a vibrant economy, a healthy environment, strong and resilient communities, and a high quality of life for all. Our work focuses on clean energy, enough clean and accessible water, healthy air, vibrant ecosystems, sustainable growth, strong communities. And while we have research in our name, we work on implementation, solution development, and policy as well. And the Water and Community Resilience team digs into those issues with expertise in the water energy nexus, nature-based solutions, coastal resilience, community engagement, and climate and resilience planning. And we also have done implementation projects focused on increasing tree cover, weatherization, and low-income solar as part of that community resilience focus. So
one of your recent projects at HARC is a white paper about water use by data centers. And, that's the topic du jour in terms of water in Texas. Definitely the hottest water topic. And probably probably in the country, or at least close to the top. So please give us some background on your new water paper. And the title of that paper is Thirsty Data in the Lone Star State, the Impact of Data Center Growth on Texas Water Supply.
We started looking at this topic because we were being asked questions about water at data centers, and there is such a lack of information about what's going on at the same time that we're seeing this huge growth in this industry. And that's not a good thing for anybody, not good for water planners, not good for communities. It breeds a sense of distrust and confusion and frustration. And so trying to fill that information gap is one thing we were wanting to do. And then another motivation is just trying to push towards an increase in transparency and better planning. So we used estimates from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab on water use per unit of electricity and the estimates for the amount of electricity that would increase in Texas from ERCOT. And ERCOT had put out a few forecasts, one from the transmission and distribution providers, one where they scaled it back to what they thought was, realistic based on permitting and other things that slow down processes. That doesn't mean that we're going to see that demand actually decrease. What it does mean is it's probably going to push to behind the meter on-site power. So we're still going to potentially see increases in data centers outside of ERCOT demand as well. And we calculated the water use based on that increased electricity use. And that gave us our total estimate of up to 161 billion gallons per year that data centers could consume by 2030. And given the larger data centers that we're seeing coming in, that number could potentially increase even further. But I do want to caveat that our estimates are just that, they're estimates. There's no public data set for water use at data centers in Texas that would tell us how much each data center or collectively all of those data centers are actually using. That's why the PUC's water survey that they're planning to put out will be very important. That information will help us understand the water use. It will help planners ensure that there's enough water available. It'll help our state water plan. There's a lot of ways that will be super beneficial. And one of them is increasing transparency, which is so important. We also make recommendations for reducing water demand, including water and energy efficiency, using dry cooling, alternative water supplies, policies that incentivize or require those behaviors, and public-private partnerships that ensure water infrastructure is paid for by data centers and doesn't result in increased costs for community members.
So let me go back and just mention, for those who are not familiar with this term, ERCOT is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. Texas has its own grid for most of the state. And the PUC is the Public Utility Commission in Texas. So just thinking about data centers themselves, we may have some listeners who are not really sure what a data center is, why there's so many of them. And so let's talk a little bit about that and how much one might use, how much water one might use on average, I guess, depending on what the average size is. But we've got a boom in artificial intelligence going on, and the data centers are related to that, are they not?
Yes. So the increase in these larger data centers is related to the AI boom. But we've had data centers for quite a while. The smaller ones in particular are common across the state. A data center is a facility that houses computing equipment. It may be used for a handful of different purposes. But for example, when you store your files in the cloud, they're in a server somewhere, they're in a data center. So we're frequently using data centers on a regular basis. And this increase in these larger data centers that are using a whole lot of water, that are getting a whole lot of news, that's essentially for that AI training because of the AI boom. And data centers can consume a lot of water depending on their size and the type of facility, the type of computing equipment, and the type of cooling technology that they use at the data center. So it really depends on the particular site and its setup, how much water it could use. But a typical data center might use around 300,000 gallons per day. And a larger data center or a big complex might use up to 5 million gallons per day. So again, it really depends on the size of the facility and what it's doing and what technologies are used. That's the on-site water at a data center. Data centers also indirectly use water because they rely on power plants. And a lot of our power plants use water for cooling. They're also using water when they use electricity.
So where do we find data centers in Texas? Are they everywhere, or are they showing up more in certain areas than others?
We see a lot of data centers in the big cities in Texas. They're in the Metroplex, the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They're in the Houston area. They're in the Austin area. They're in the San Antonio area. That's where most of our data centers are concentrated. They're in those areas because of access to electricity, access to fiber. They were able to find land, and they're trying to site near a labor force. So that's the general reason why they're frequently in the Texas Triangle. But we're starting to see those larger facilities pop up in West Texas, again, because of access to land and access to power in that area. There's a lot of electricity and energy and natural gas available in West Texas, and it's hard to get that to the rest of the state. So it's actually cheaper to use in West Texas, which makes that a good site for them from a cost perspective.
So West Texas has got less expensive land, less expensive energy. What about water? I'm wondered, I guess, first of all, do we have a sense of whether these data centers are using more surface water than groundwater, and also when they locate out in West Texas, are they locating in areas that are not under the jurisdiction of a groundwater management district? Any thoughts on those?
So frequently data centers are getting water from municipalities. They may also have other contracts or wells that they're planning to drill, but the ones that we have information on are getting their water from municipalities. So that means that it kind of varies whether that municipality depends on groundwater or surface water. So the two of the large facilities that are getting constructed out in West Texas, Stargate and the Fermi facility outside Amarillo, both are intending to get water from those municipalities. Stargate from Abilene, which relies on surface water, and Fermi's facility from Amarillo, which relies on groundwater. So it does vary by the facility. We are seeing data centers look for the land availability, the power price, the proximity to fiber, and whether there's going to be a smooth ride through zoning restrictions and permitting restrictions that could include water use, but generally it's related to the site access rather than the water use, and the water use is something that would come later. So if there's a municipality, they're generally trying to seek it from that entity because they're able to get the water through the existing infrastructure that's available.
So do we have like a estimated number of how many of these centers there are and how many we're going to have over the next decade?
In our analysis, we relied on data from Baxtel. There are a few different organizations that are tracking data center growth through the United States and have their own data sets. Baxtel is tracking 596 data centers in Texas, so nearly 600. About a year ago, it was closer to 400. So there's, again, been a rapid increase in data centers in Texas. And their energy use and the associated water use as well. We don't know in 10 years how many data centers there could be, but based on the estimates of the increased electricity use and what ERCOT foresees again, the state grid operator, we could see between 2 and 10 times the amount of electricity demand that we had in 2025 by 2030. And that could mean a great deal of growth in data centers as that happens. Or it could be that we don't see as many numbers increase, but we see the size increase. And the electricity use associated with that would still be quite large.
So you noted that there's an estimate that maybe these centers will be using 160 billion gallons of water or so by 2030. But you also mentioned that we don't really have a good handle on the data centers that are on groundwater. So is that figure, the 160 billion gallons, which is, I'm guessing that's 160 billion gallons a year by 2030. Does that include an estimate for groundwater, or does that not include that?
That's total water use from data centers. So that would include both the surface water and the groundwater that they're using.
And so right now, I guess data centers are really not contemplated in the water planning process directly. I guess if, maybe, municipal users, water suppliers have an overall estimate of how much water they're going to need, but it may not really account for those centers. What do you think is going to happen with that? Does there seem to be interest in making sure, at least on the regional water planning group level, that they have a handle on that?
There is an effort to try to get the data. So you're right that the data center growth that we've been discussing is not forecasted in the state water plan. If there are known users, so they're already online, they could be included through municipal water demand. If they're not using municipal supplies, and they didn't answer the historical water use survey, which the Water Development Board has shared that data centers were not answering that survey, the manufacturing water use survey, then we don't have those estimates. And those estimates are how we get to a prediction of how much water we could be using in Texas. The Water Development Board does not make a habit of forecasting manufacturing or steam electric water demands, the water use for the sector that would include those facilities outside of municipal water supplies. So those are not included either. So that means that in the 2022 plan, the current one, they're not included. And the 2027 plan, the one that will be published, they're not included because we didn't have the data available. But in the last legislative session, there was a rider in the budget that required the Public Utility Commission to gather that information through their existing regulation process. So as data centers are trying to get interconnected to the grid, for example, they would need to provide their water demand information to the Public Utility Commission. That could be a route for how that survey is administered and how that data is collected. So we could get information about existing data centers, not every data center, but the data centers that do connect to the grid and would be regulated by the Public Utility Commission would need to report that information. And then the Public Utility Commission could share that with the Water Development Board, and the Water Development Board could use that data to provide it to the regional water planning groups. And the regional water planning groups can only use that information from the Water Development Board as their data in their plans. So it's important that the Water Development Board gets accurate data so that the regional water planning groups have that accurate data for their planning. And then we can actually plan for the water supplies that are needed for these municipalities that are providing this water. And they're not trading the water that's actually meant for their community to provide data centers and then having to go back and get more expensive water for their community later.
So when do we anticipate the PUC's survey will be completed?
I don't actually have a date on that. They just announced that they're working on that survey very recently.
Okay. So, when I started hearing about data centers, I don't know if a few years ago or so, I started also thinking about Bitcoin mines. And I don't know if they're similar in some ways. I mean, I think, they're kind of a lot of them are warehouses with servers and other computer related equipment. They are, Bitcoin mines, things like that. I don't know to the extent that they're regulated or we know where they are, but, is there kind of a similar, concern about water use with those facilities? And, do we know how many we have of those?
Those also require water for cooling, or actually those also require cooling, and sometimes water would be used. They may have just like an air conditioning type setup, depending on how small the facility is, and that could be how they cool it, and then wouldn't have a water demand, but it might have a pretty noisy building or a lot of vibration associated with that. I don't have a handle on how many Bitcoin mines there are throughout the state, but that is part of the data set that Baxtel collects.
So, in my experience, there are a lot of, significant water issues in Texas and elsewhere that water professionals are very concerned about, but the public doesn't seem to, care about, even though we're often like standing on our desk yelling, you ought to be thinking about this. Hey, this is an issue. That's not the case here. Boy, I have seen a lot of stories about communities really expressing a lot of concern about data centers and their water use. What do you think is the difference with this issue that's captured the attention of so many communities with regard to the potential impact of these centers?
I think they're a bit of a boogeyman in participating in non-disclosure agreements, in hiding the information about the facilities, how much electricity, how much water, where that water could be coming from, how much that could impact the community around that, and not being upfront with that information with the community. They create sort of this shadow situation where they're operating behind closed doors. Community members don't like that. If data centers were more upfront about what the impacts could be and how they were planning to mitigate them and how they wanted to work with communities to improve the conditions in that community, to make sure that water stayed available, to invest in those communities, I think that there would be a different stance from some, not all, but from some communities that may be more welcoming to a facility. I think the approach that they're taking is not one of collaboration. It's very business minded, but not necessarily community minded. And community members are very upset about that now. I also think the trend towards AI is different than the existing data centers. The existing data centers, again, I mentioned you store files in the cloud. You're probably using a data center. That's seen as more necessary than the AI training for the AI infrastructure that we're building. Community members maybe don't see that as important as the data centers that had existed before. And then on top of that, the training centers are very large. So they're getting a lot more attention because they're not just a building on a city block. They're a huge facility with a big impact, and they're quite a bit more noticeable now.
So, I always wonder about that. Why some companies will try to keep something, as proprietary when it's certain to cause a real concern, especially a local community that's small, and all of a sudden here comes a big new industrial facility of some kind. Just wonder why there's not more effort to try to communicate with the community up front. Here's how much water and energy we're going to use, and we've just determined that there's this amount of water available regionally or locally. Just that strategy always confuses me.
I agree. I'm a very collaboration forward kind of person. I would prefer that tactic, working with communities and not just with the leaders or certain members who can have that information. I think it's just, there's more effort involved, there's more care, there's more thought, and probably it is a lot more expensive to do to have a collaborative process with community involved. At the same time, I think it's probably very expensive to try over and over and over to get a permit approved, and then have to move your site because it didn't get approved because you didn't get community buy-in in the first place. So I think we're going to see more of that type of situation. And I think that will push companies towards a more collaborative approach. And we're already seeing that with companies like Microsoft announcing that they're not planning to use any community water and that they are looking into efforts to offset their water use by paying for projects nearby. And we've seen Google put out a request for information for projects in the same basin as their data centers to offset the water use that they had as well.
One of the things I was doing while you were answering that question is I was trying to translate 161 billion gallons annually by 2030 into acre feet, because when I hear acre feet, I always know what I'm talking about. I'm not sure I got this right, but it looks like that's about 500,000 acre feet.
I have the number because we reported it in acre feet too. It's just not in front of me. I can get that.
And if I'm right about that, that's more than San Antonio uses annually. It's less than the greater Austin area, I think, uses. That means Austin and the outlying, suburbs and cities. But I'm not totally sure about that. It's a significant amount of water. If my calculation is correct. Thinking about that, I remember several years ago when, people were very concerned about chip plants and how much water they were using. And it seems like, chip plants, or the newer ones, have made efforts to reduce their water use and recycle more of their water to reduce their water footprint. I mean, it still can be significant, but that there were efforts to do that within the industry, at least in the United States. I'm wondering, is this something that might be similar with data centers that I guess I don't even know how long, the equipment in a data center is used before it becomes obsolete and is replaced by a new one or something. But I'm just wondering, is there some expectation that, 10, 20 years from now, a similar facility or storing, I guess, a similar amount of data might use less water?
We're already seeing data centers now using more than 50% less water than data centers 6-8 years ago. There are estimates from 2018 that put data center water use well above what it is right now. And we're seeing reports put out from major companies like Microsoft, where they're getting their water use efficiency down very low on their cooling technologies. They're not necessarily fully in operation across all of their data centers yet, but they are working on the technologies to get better, more efficient cooling out of their systems. So they're using less water per unit of energy. Now, as the facilities get larger, that efficiency is great, but it still means that there's a large water demand at a large facility. And so that's still something where we need to work on making sure that that community has water available, that it's how water is paid for is done fairly, and data centers are paying their share, and community members aren't paying for that and supporting that cost.
Interesting. So, just kind of getting close here to wrapping up our discussion. Any other thoughts about data centers that you would like to share from us, or other findings from your study or your white paper? Sorry.
I think we covered most of it. We're really, with this work, trying to get an estimate out to the public because there was a lack of information. But again, it's not perfect. We based it on the publicly available information. And as we get more information from data centers, as they become more public with their information, as they respond to the surveys from the state government, we'll have better numbers to be able to improve those estimates, and better planning from the state to make sure there's water available for everyone, and that we can do that affordably and ensure that everybody still has access to water.
Great. Now I remember I was going to ask you this question. I finally remember what it was. Of course, we have an issue in West Texas in particular with excess amounts of produced water, water that was used for hydraulic fracturing, oil and gas wells. I'm guessing that's not, a readily available supply for cooling a data center, or maybe it is. I don't know. Imagine that there are probably some water quality requirements associated with data centers.
For the water that actually touches the chips, if that's the type of cooling internally at the data center, they'd want cleaner water. For water in the external cooling system, and I'll back up to say a good deal of the cooling systems are an internal loop of some kind or mechanism where the computing equipment is cooled, and then a fluid is run over them or looped around. And that fluid needs to, before it can recirculate back and cool more, it needs to be cooled down itself. So a heat rejection technology has to be paired with that system. So for that internal loop, data centers would need cleaner water or whatever fluid that they're using. For that external loop, a water chiller might be used, an air chiller might be used, a cooling tower might be used, whatever that mechanism is. Generally, you also want water that's not as salty as produced water is, because you could corrode equipment. There are also microbes in produced water, so you could foul that equipment. So some amount of treatment would be needed on that produced water. And because produced water is far more salty than even seawater in West Texas, that's probably going to be a lot of treatment. But again, it depends on the cooling technology that is used. So maybe data center teams are working on technologies that could use that saltier water. I'm not aware of those studies. If treatment is going to be needed, that would be energy intensive and costly. And likely, unless there was a requirement to use that water, unlikely to be the choice that they make. So it depends on the situation, but I don't see that as a super viable option right now, but we could get there in the future.
Yeah, it's part of the calculus for locating those centers is the cost of running them, and cleaning up produced water is expensive, and I would imagine it's probably not an ideal supply for a data center, but particularly how you describe they do cooling for it. So yeah, that makes sense.
However, there is a lot of produced water available, and if there's nowhere for oil and gas companies to dispose it, it may be in their best interest to do some of that pre-treatment to be able to sell water. So we may see that happen in the future as well.
Well, that's a discussion for another day. And it makes me want to jot that one down. Maybe I should have somebody come on and talk about, produced water and wherever you are with trying to find productive uses for it. So let me go to our final question. Margaret, how can our listeners find out about HARC and also find your white paper on data center water use?
They can go to harcresearch.org, HARCRESEARCH.org. That's our website for HARC. And on the main page, if you scroll a little bit, you'll see the slide for thirsty data. And you can click on that and get to the blog and the white paper.
Great. Well, Margaret, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks again for having me.
This has been Talkless Water, and my guest today was Dr. Margaret Cook, Vice President for Water and Community Resilience at HARC. And she recently authored Thirsty Data and the Lone Star State, the Impact of Data Center Growth on Texas Water Supply. I want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. Finally, I want to give a big thank you to Anna Jones and Sarah Wingfield at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each episode of Talkless Water ready to flow. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review to let us know how we did. This is Todd Bottler. Let's talk water again soon.